kind of world economy and kind of challenges that the cooperative movement and indeed every human being will face in the coming years, especially in the context of our environmental and social challenges. The main message that I want to give is that next year is a crucial year for setting that future course. And I'm going to describe that from the point of view of my responsibilities at the United Nations in helping Secretary General Ban Ki-moon lead and work with the 193 governments of the United Nations to find a new course for sustainable development. I think it'll be clear in my talk, and I know it will be very clear in the discussion, that the cooperative movement has an enormous role to play in this future. Sustainable development as a concept has been with us for some time, but I'm very happy that in 2012, when the world met on the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit, sustainable development was adopted as the organizing principle for our coming generation by the UN member states. That was not a happy summit in June 2012, because 20 years after the Earth Summit, a summit which had adopted 3 major environmental treaties on climate change and on fighting desertification and on protecting biodiversity, the verdict was that those treaties had not succeeded. The course for our world remains ever more perilous in our collision with nature. And so the governments in 2012 put sustainable development on the pedestal, I would say, and decided to launch clear sustainable development goals as sharper guideposts for the world in the period from 2015 onward. The essence of sustainable development and the essence of these new Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, is a holistic framework. This is not news to the cooperative movement, but a holistic framework that integrates economic, social, and environmental objectives in a broad and integrated strategic manner. And we certainly do not have that at this point. The essence of the strategy is to set goals. The idea that we need not New Year's resolutions, but generational resolutions to help get the world reoriented in a way which is even sane, I would say, from the point of view of planetary safety and the well-being of our children. And I'd like to refer to an observation about leadership that President John F. Kennedy made at another crucial moment at the height of the Cold War, when he successfully negotiated a first treaty with the Soviet Union, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. He said in the quest for that treaty, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. This is, I think, the essence of goal-based development and goal-based security for the world, that we need to define our goals more clearly and indeed make them seem and make them be more manageable and less remote, so that people can take hope and not despair. And this is a time of profound worry in the world, I think almost everywhere. So the idea that we need some hope and some clarity is a good thing. And I personally say this a day after Canada voted to start launching its own bombing in Syria and Iraq. I view a miserable decision, I have to say, speaking on my own. That kind of approach will not solve any of our sustainable development goals. We need to find clear, peace-making approaches approaches to the world's challenges. It happens that next year is a decisive year. It's a little bit by accident of the calendar. Several wheels turned together to make 2015 decisive. The first was the Rio Plus 20 Summit, which said we need new development goals. Since the Millennium Development Goal period ends in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goal period, or SDG period, was timed to begin in 2015 with the negotiations on those SDGs to be concluded this coming year. Second, you will recall in Copenhagen in 2009 the debacle of the attempt to set a new climate agreement. When that failed in Copenhagen, the world's governments in 2010 said we have to make another attempt, and indeed there is only one chance remaining to keep the world's rise in temperature below the 2 degrees Celsius limit that scientists have warned us about. And so they set 2015 also as the year to reach that climate agreement. And then the government said we have these two broad agendas set for 2015. How are we going to make the financial system of the world, including development assistance, but also private capital markets, work towards the achievement of sustainable development and climate change control? And so they added a third high-level summit for 2015. So in July next year in Addis Ababa, there will be an International Finance for Development Summit of heads of state. 2 months after that, in September 2015, world leaders will have an extraordinary 3-day session on sustainable development at head of state level, the longest such conference ever. So very important for us to help set sustainable development goals. And then in December 2015 in Paris is the intention to finally reach an operational agreement to meet the ever-growing climate change disaster. And it's nothing short of a disaster. And it is continuing to build, and it remains unabated, unmitigated till today. Now, why do we have a chance for success in terms of this broad agenda? I'll just show one piece of the answer, and that is that we're the heirs of a technological, miraculous age. I think the information age gives us tools that are unimaginable in the past. What's shown here is the famous Moore's Law of the doubling of the transistor count on semiconductor chips every 2 years, which has been going on since 1959. So in 1961, Robert Noyce put 2 transistors on a chip, and that was a great scientific breakthrough. Last year, Intel put 5 billion transistors on a chip, and that's what makes possible our information age. And the fact now that the world is instantly connected with 7 billion mobile subscribers, and all that makes possible for healthcare, for finance, for education, for dynamic development in so many sectors. And it is contributing already to a dramatic reduction of the extreme poverty rate in the developing world, which has come down by half between 1990 and 2010, and by more than half if we had the data till today, which we're still waiting for from the World Bank. But the poverty rate has probably come down from something around 43% in 1990 in the developing world to perhaps 16% as of 2015. This is the great news. Okay, this is almost the end of the good news, though, because the world is filled with big and growing problems. I used to take it take it personally, I should say, that almost every city that I arrived in the past 3 years as a UN representative or the Secretary General have rights. And I thought this was a kind of a warm greeting for me. But the fact of the matter is, obviously, there is instability all over the world. And the instability is because of the turmoil of life path, because of the dislocations of the world ecology and world economy, because of the high youth unemployment rates, and because of the inability of our governments to address these circumstances until today. We have a governance crisis that is compounded of growing social inequalities, high youth unemployment, shifting labor markets, extreme environmental instability, and the dislocation of people, often culminating in utter disaster. Syria, I think it's important to recall, had 10 years of serious drought, food shortages, soaring food prices, before it finally exploded in protests, brutal crackdown by government, an insurrection, and then a flood of arms into the region in which we are now contributing in a rather mindless way, I have to say. So these often have ecological roots at the start. One way that the ecological crisis has been described is as our violation of planetary boundaries. The world economy has grown perhaps 250 times in scale since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The world population has increased tenfold, roughly. The world economy per person 25 or 30 times. But the planet hasn't changed at all in size. And so the pressure of now a $90 trillion annual output on a finite planet means that we are violating basic ecological thresholds, whether it's climate change, the acidification of oceans, the extreme runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from the 150 billion tons of nitrogen and phosphorus-based mineral fertilizers that we use each year, to the depletion of fresh water, to the loss of biodiversity, to the massive aerosol pollution that makes the air almost unbreathable in large parts of Asia these days. These are the planetary boundaries that are a threat and also unaddressed. The most important of these planetary boundaries is human-induced climate change coming from greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a picture that is a stark picture of our reality. The dotted black line on the left is the rising number of billions of tons of carbon dioxide emitted per year. We're up to around 10 billion tons of C, that is of carbon, which is equivalent to about 36 billion tons of CO2, carbon dioxide, emitted each year by the world's burning of coal, oil, and gas. We're on a trajectory which is the upper red line. That is a trajectory that will lead the world to a warming of 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. A level of warming that is considered catastrophic risk category by the world's scientists and ecologists. We need to be on a trajectory of the lower blue line, which is to stop these emissions by around 2070 by decarbonizing our economies, shifting from coal, oil, and gas to wind and solar power, to safe nuclear energy, to carbon capture and sequestration, and to other possible low-carbon technologies. We're not doing it right now. Our governments don't even recognize it. There was a scathing report that was released yesterday about Canada's lack of a strategy on climate change. It's well worth reading. It's shocking. When government is basically representing oil and coal interests, it is not representing the public broadly. Because we need oil and coal executives, with all respect, have children. And their children are going to live on this planet too. And we have to start getting serious about this to bend this curve of emissions. As I've traveled Just this year, the number of disasters that I have seen or been just following immediate thereafter, droughts in the Indonesian archipelago, unprecedented 1 in 500-year floods in the Balkans, the worst drought in modern history in California, drying up these water reservoirs. Massive drought in Brazil, which is why your coffee prices at Starbucks are rising, or at Pete's, or Seattle's Best, or whichever you favor, have been rising in recent weeks because there is an extreme drought underway in parts of Brazil. Massive devastating floods in Japan, where I just returned from a couple of days ago. The report yesterday showed how Canada is experiencing dramatic warming in recent decades and a massive increase of forest fires, along with the drying and the warming. And the month of August, the most recent month for which we have monthly data, was the warmest recorded August in record history, going back to 1881. This is our grim reality of violating the planetary boundaries. So what will these SDGs be? I was happy to see that the International Cooperative Alliance has put forward its recommendations as well as what these SDGs should be. I lead a group for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN, which also has made recommendations for 10 Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to get to a list something like this: universal access for health and education, fighting to end extreme poverty, controlling climate change with low-carbon energy, sustainable cities, social inclusion, reducing inequalities, and good governance. This kind of framework, holistic framework, will be adopted next year. Whether it will be implemented is really going to be our greatest drama. What are the challenges to meet the Sustainable Development Goals? There are many, because our world's complicated. It's big, 7.3 billion people. When I talked about this last year, I said 7.2 billion people. Now it's rounded up to 7.3 billion because we're adding about 80 million persons per year to the world population. That's part of the challenge. By 2024, we're going to have 8 billion people. By 2040, it will be 9 billion people on the current trajectory. Voluntary reductions in fertility rates in the high fertility countries would certainly be part of finding an effective solution, but only one part. We are going to need technological transformation to move from a high carbon to a low carbon global energy system. We're going to need equity in social service provision, especially for health and education. We need community-based protection of natural resources, rather than the impunity with which large companies misuse these natural resources. We need a strengthening of local governance, a decentralization and strengthening of local governance. We need better sharing of work, learning, and leisure, flexicurity, and other work-sharing arrangements in a rapidly changing labor market. We need to restrain arbitrary management power. This is especially about the U.S. CEO model, where the CEO hires the compensation committee to then pay the CEO 500 times what their workers make. It's completely out of control. It's a bogus system. We need responsible investing, and I know we're going to have a discussion about that in a moment, and financial markets. My view, Wall Street is a lawless institution. And I don't have to just say that. They've paid about $100 billion in fines so far. But you know, the CEOs remain in charge, the very ones that pay these fines. Out of their shareholders' money, they keep their positions. This is completely unaccountable. It is lawless. And it is, of course, the U.S. governance system right now. Which brings me to the next item on the list, which is re-democratizing our democracies. The United States is a cesspool of corruption, unfortunately. Our next election round will probably be $8 billion of campaign contributions. And that's not from poor people being represented, I can tell you. The 2016 election will probably be a $10 billion election cycle. Well, you get government by the rich, for the rich, and of the rich. And then you get the lawlessness that goes along with it. And I think fundamentally we are going to need to find that for the broad majority of all of us, and I think there's even hope for the rich, shared values. Now I say that pointedly because they have a huge responsibility in a world in which wealth has soared at the very top. And most of the people in the world are struggling. I don't have time to elaborate on such a complex agenda, and of course with this group I don't need to because there's so much expertise here. But let me just say, from my position as a development economist, economic history has been characterized by waves of technological change. From the steam engine onward, we've had 5 of these long technological waves. The most recent one being our information technology revolution, computing, semiconductors, and now internet and mobility and the pervasiveness of digitization, the digital revolution in all parts of science, technology, and economy. We're going to need a 6th wave of sustainable technologies. I want to stress that this technological transformation is fundamental. Some people dream of returning to a simpler world. Technology has done harm, they say, let's pull back. But with 8 billion people on the planet, you cannot pull back. These people need to be fed, provisioned, find safety, and this can only happen with technologies that can meet those needs, but it requires a deep transformation of these technologies, starting with decarbonization, and I would add sustainable agriculture as a fundamental need, because agriculture is both highly vulnerable to climate change, but it also is the #1 cause of human-induced disturbance of the planet, whether it's water or biodiversity or deforestation or even anthropogenic emissions. Agriculture is at or near the top of the list. There's good news. We're very good at technology if we put our mind to it. This is a graph showing that the cost of sequencing a human genome in just 13 years went from $100 million per genome down to $1,000 per genome. That is scientific genius, and it shows what we can accomplish. And I would add the fact that we've gone from 20,000 mobile phone subscribers in 1980 to 7 billion mobile phone subscribers today is also evidence of what can be done. And that's no small thing if you work, as I do, in very poor villages that were completely isolated before and now have access to information, can keep together with their families, can have a market price and receive a weather forecast. This kind of advance is of profound significance. And this graph shows the 100-fold reduction of cost of photovoltaics, which is also giving us hope for the ability to make breakthroughs in low-carbon energy. Technology is a part of the answer, but governance is obviously a fundamental part of the answer. We do not have good governance. And governance needs to be defined both as political governance and business governance. And when we look to the Sustainable Development Goals next year and talk about good governance, this has to be governance that is multi-sector across key stakeholders and absolutely governance directed towards the business sector as well. And that's where the voice of the international cooperative movement is so crucial, because you are the sector of good business governance, and it has to be heard. And the values that you propound are critical to good business governance. And we don't see this now in so much of the corporate sector of the world economy. What are these challenges of business governance? The impunity of powerful multinational companies, which is probably our number one factor, because the companies are more powerful than our governments. The companies determine our governments, and the companies set the international policies, and they act with impunity. Where is ExxonMobil on climate change? Where is Chevron on climate change? These are the giants that bring up hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. They stand quietly at the sidelines, but behind the scenes they elect our governments. And that impunity has to stop. Where is Shell after 50 years of operations in the Niger Delta, which has left it in a complete disaster, a cancer zone, utterly polluted, utterly lawless? You can't just act with impunity in this world, or we're not going to have a world anything like the kind of world that we want. As I said, the global financial industry has been lawless. Your deliberate, direct financial fraud repeated in the last 10 years, selling toxic assets knowingly and saying, oh, that's their business if they didn't know that we were conspiring to make toxic assets. Unbelievable. The difficulty of enforcing environmental regulations in low-income countries. A world of tax and secrecy havens, which is not by accident. Believe me, the British Virgin Islands doesn't have trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars of accounts there because BVI is so clever. They do it because it's been constructed by the United Kingdom, by the United States, by the rules of the game. And these secrecy havens in the Caribbean, in fact, all over the world, are constructed by the UK, the United States, and others, and they have to stop. Because it means that governments that should have revenues from natural resources, for example, can't even keep their hands on them. Because there is so much opportunity for fraud, tax evasion, and secrecy. And when I come into contact with companies degrading or exploiting the environment in low-income settings, and you try to find out about these companies, what do you find out? That they are a post office box in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. They're a shell to stop responsibility. And so this is a big part of the international system. I mentioned the lobbying power of the oil and the gas industry, which is, I don't have to tell Canadians, Australians, Americans anything about this. It's out of control. They own one political party in the United States, the Republican Party, and they half own the other party. And that's enough to govern. Then we have tremendous corporate power at the local level. Why does the United States have the most expensive healthcare system in the world? Because our healthcare is highly monopolized in a privatized form. This is where health cooperatives could be so important. But our health business in the United States is an incredibly profitable, highly concentrated local monopoly business, virtually unregulated, where the salaries of the tops of the hospitals are multi-million-dollar salaries. And the costs of healthcare are twice what they are in any normal country in the world. This is a kind of corporate abuse. And now we have a range of treaties. Canada's part of it. The United States is pushing hard, where investors are supposed to be given even more rights vis-a-vis government in these so-called investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. This is part of the so-called TPP negotiations and the TTIP negotiations. These are scams. these investor-state dispute resolution settlements. What they are is to disempower governments so that the investors have even more power and can't even be controlled by state regulation. Because if the state tries, then it goes to a non-judicial arbitration panel that is secret, that is unbeholden, and that is largely appointed by industry. And that's why the U.S. government is pushing so hard for this kind of dispute settlement mechanism, because the lobbies are right behind the White House in this. And this has to stop as well. Just to finish then, I put your governance principles on the table. I don't have to repeat them, but you can see how relevant they are in the context of the challenge that we face and how powerfully applicable they are in resource management, finance, agriculture, social services, innovation, infrastructure, and other sectors. I'll stop here. I started with a quotation of President Kennedy. I'll end with a quotation of President Kennedy from the same period. As he was pursuing peace, he was trying to convince Americans that we could actually find a way forward in a world of such hate and diversity, and a world seemingly on a path to self-destruction. And he ended with these words, which I think have to be the spirit if we are to succeed. President Kennedy said famously, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal."